In our video conference today, we will be discussing 5 different topics on how to have your company have strategic organizational communications. We'll be touching on the 5 different topics, including understanding systems thinking and critical thinking, the advantages of diversity, challenges of globalization, and finally we'll finish with understanding technology. We will explain to you why they're important and how you can implement them in your company. The first topic to discuss to enhance strategic organizational communication is understanding systems thinking. Your company is a system made up of many different varying parts. The parts work together to make the system run smoothly. It is difficult to think about the company as a whole because we've been taught to find the problem and find one single solution. Companies are complicated and there might not be one single solution. There are 7 different steps to help start thinking of your company in terms of systems thinking. The first step states that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Systems are more than just the parts that make them up. The ending product of the cake is much more than the eggs and batter before the oven. When all the parts come together is when the system is fully working. Try looking at your company as a whole instead of looking at individual departments. The second part to systems thinking is that cause and effect relationships are complex. Because all the parts are interconnected, it is not possible to find a single, simple cause for events or problems of the system. The answer isn't to assign blame, but to encourage personal responsibility. Personal responsibility is crucial to an effective system. The third part is that it takes time to find the right levers. While systems are not whole and their parts are independent, some variables, people, and units are particularly important. These parts stand at central points in the system where they are in a position to influence a number of other variables, people, or units, or where they can filter or moderate the effects of other variables. These parts are the lever that can be used to change and control the system. The fourth step is to understand a system. Don't just focus on the system itself. Every system is embedded in a group of larger systems, and every system is made up of smaller subsystems. At any given time, the actions of any of the many employees of the subsystem of an organization can be influenced by the actions of others in the organization. It is important to understand the influence coming from the outside. The fifth step in systems thinking is companies must adapt or they will die. Technology is changing every day. Companies must adapt to a new global world or the company won't survive. The sixth step states that history is important in an organizational system. It is important to remember that the systems are made up of people and not a machine. Employees bring a wide range of beliefs and values to the organization, and this changes the way they communicate. Their strategic choices are influenced by the entire matrix of pressures, goals, and concerns that they experience. It is important to consider each employee as a unique individual. The seventh and final step of systems thinking is that systems must constantly learn and renew themselves. These 7 steps will help you better understand systems thinking and why it is important for your company. Remember the system and the individual parts, and your company is on its way to success. Next, Stephen will discuss the importance of critical thinking.
I'm going to briefly discuss critical thinking, why it is important in organizations, and how it is implemented within organizations. And to start off, you first need to understand that all individuals come with taken for granted assumptions, meanings, expectations, and thinking processes. When I say that these assumptions are taken for granted, I mean that they are automatic within someone's mind. They are not really challenged or even thought about, really. It's just generally understood that that's the way things are, or that's the way you're supposed to think about something, or that's the way you're supposed to do something. And that's thinking uncritically about these assumptions. And this is where, and an example of that is on the Titanic. Like, everyone assumed that the Titanic could not sink and it would not sink. And when it did sink, or when it did start to sink, and after it sunk, people started thinking critically about these assumptions. Like, why weren't there enough lifeboats on why weren't there enough lifeboats on the Titanic? And well, it's because people assumed, without challenging it, that the Titanic couldn't sink. So no one worried about having enough lifeboats. And this is also identifies another trend that people usually can't identify these assumptions until something bad has happened. Like in this example, when the Titanic sunk, everyone said, "Why are there no lifeboats?" And this is another good time to bring up an example of control called hegemony that these assumptions have on people. When the Titanic was sinking, the lifeboats were mostly used for women and children because that was the predominant way of thinking of the people on the ship, that women and children should have priority in the lifeboats. And it controlled the people. That was the predominant way of thinking. But not everyone thought that way. That's why a lot of men did make it on the boats. And yeah, obviously, if you're sinking in a boat, you're going to want a place and you're going to challenge that hegemony and that way of thinking, and you're going to think critically about it. And again, that's just another example of people only being able to identify these assumptions and challenge them in times of stress or when bad things are happening. So that's the deal with critical thinking. Now that we've discussed why critical thinking is important for organizations, we're going to talk about valuing differences and the advantage of valuing diversity in organizations.
Hey, so we're talking about keys to strategic organization. Specifically, I'm talking about thinking global and the challenges of globalization and how this works with the workplace, works in the workplace. There's increasing levels of education that has been involved with the creation of true global flow of capital and trade to create a new environment for organizations all over the world. There are different terms specifically for this, like cultural homogenization and hybridization. And there's a lot of debates whether it's, good or not, because sometimes it's a rich culture ends up being so standard and you turn around and everybody's alike, and whether that's good or not. For example, like a lot of American ideas and stuff being imposed on other countries that are so traditional, and whether or not that is something that should be appropriate or not. This also applies to whether or not globalization is good within the workplace. For example, the McDonaldization, which says that then it goes to term with whether this applies with diversity in organization, globalization, diversity. For example, there's a lot of times that companies nowadays outsource to places like India, mainly in India that I remember, because there's a show called Outsource. It's in India, because it can help the revenue, and a lot of times it's cheaper for people not in America. The wages seem to be cheaper. Is this applicable? Good question. I personally think that